Before Canada became the country we know today, millions of Indigenous people lived across this land with strong cultures, governments, and languages. But when Europeans arrived, everything changed. Not because Indigenous peoples were weak, but because they were hit by forces no human society could have survived untouched. The deadliest force was disease. Long before many Indigenous nations even saw Europeans, illnesses like smallpox, influenza, measles, and tuberculosis swept across the land. With no immunity, entire communities were wiped out. In places like British Columbia, up to 90% of Indigenous people died. Colonizers began calling the land empty, even though thriving nations had lived there for thousands of years. And during conflicts, some European officers even gave out smallpox-infected blankets. These epidemics didn't just take lives. They took elders, knowledge keepers, and leaders, causing deep cultural collapse. While disease weakened nations, colonization pushed forward. Settlers treated Indigenous territories as empty land and pressured communities into treaties they believed were agreements to share land, not surrender it. Governments then restricted movement, created reserves on small or poor quality land, and introduced policies like the pass system. People who once moved freely across huge territories were confined to tiny portions of their homelands. Conflict and warfare played a role too. Indigenous nations often allied with European powers, like those who fought with the British in the War of 1812. But despite alliances, land continued to be taken. Rebellions like the 1885 Northwest Resistance were crushed, and leaders like Louis Riel were executed. Still, war caused far fewer losses than disease and government policies. Then came the most damaging force of all, assimilation. Through residential schools, over 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families and placed in institutions designed to erase their identities. Children were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their culture, and many suffered abuse. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission later called this cultural genocide. And once residential schools began to close, another wave hit, the 60s scoop, where thousands of Indigenous children were placed into non-Indigenous homes without consent. Today, Indigenous children are still overrepresented in foster care because of these historic harms. Laws solidified this control. The Indian Act of 1876 allowed the government to dictate identity, culture, and governance. Ceremonies like the potlatch were banned, and people could lose their legal status simply by marrying outside their community. The 1969 White Paper even proposed eliminating Indigenous status and treaty rights entirely, but strong resistance from Indigenous leaders forced the government to withdraw it. All these forces, disease, land loss, assimilation, and restrictive laws, created long-lasting impacts still felt today. Many Indigenous communities face issues like inadequate housing, poverty, lack of clean water, and overrepresentation in child welfare and the justice system. Languages and traditions were deeply damaged, and trauma continues across generations. Yet through all of this, Indigenous nations survived. Today, there is powerful cultural revival, language programs, land rights movements, court victories, and national calls for reconciliation. As Indigenous scholars say, we went through waves of apocalypse, but we are still here. Understanding this history isn't about guilt, it's about truth. And it's the first step toward reconciliation. If you learned something new, hit like, subscribe, and share so more people can understand this story. Thanks for watching.